Understanding modern homelessness requires a sense of history, a sense of engagement with economics, a sense of understanding basic human psychology, a sense of our ability to look a little farther down the road than perhaps we normally do most of the time. And the reason that those things are so critical is that all of our assumptions about this particular problem are inherently wrong. Our assumptions are primarily that the people that are homeless in our community today are the consequence of failed personal choices by the person who's living outside, laying on the ground at night, shooting heroin by the stars, trying to, as best they can, figure out how to survive tomorrow, focusing on the 6 inches in front of their face most of the time. All of our beliefs or assumptions, our thinking about this problem is just inherently wrong because we're concentrating on the wrong thing. Instead of looking outside our window as we drive through downtown, instead of pausing on the sidewalk as we walk past someone in distress, and focusing on what we see in front of us, really what we ought to be doing most of the time is holding up a mirror to ourselves, because most of the conclusions that we draw about the people that we see outside on a regular basis are really a reflection of our fears, a reflection of our growing concern about our own place in the world, a collection of fears about whether or not we are going to be able to navigate this increasingly difficult to navigate and unstable economic system that we are all living in. It requires an ability to kind of understand what the political economy of the United States really is. It is a political economy that's based on a set of moral assumptions and also on a set of competitive principles that are, by their very nature, going to leave a remainder of folks who are unable to compete in that system. And as a result of that, will have a very difficult time surviving on a day-to-day basis. There was a time not so long ago in the mid-1950s, early 1960s, when the American ethic, larger American culture, essentially asserted that it was possible to have prosperity for all. That was a conversation that went back deeper into the American past, into the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, had been revived again during the Depression in the 1930s. But the general conclusion after the end of the Second World War was we were living in a world in which it was possible for everybody, to steal a phrase from a prior generation, to have a chicken in the pot, to be able to own a house, to be able to own a car, to hold down a good job, raise a family, perhaps even on a single family income, and to participate in a larger, more global sense in American civilization. Move forward in time to the 1990s, 30 years after a generation of disinvestment in the social safety net that had, sort of been created to address this element of American civilization who were struggling to keep up, struggling to remain competitive. And we began to see fractures in that American consensus. We began to see fractures in that American competitive system. We began to see fractures in the idea that there was enough wealth out there for all of us and that we could all, with proper application of effort, participate in this global civilization of plenty. And that was not because somehow we lost as a civilization, somehow we lost as a generation moral commitment. It was not because we somehow are less ambitious or less hardworking or less capable than our grandparents' generation. It was not because we somehow had engaged in acts of hedonism or we had fallen away from religion or any of those normal explanations that are applied to why folks are struggling with modern homelessness. It was in fact a deliberate set of choices, set of public policy choices made by state and federal government in particular, but increasingly local government as well across the United States, to undermine, to disinvest the social safety net that we had constructed in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And as that social safety net began to fray, as the fibers of it began to grow more narrow, and the gaps between the net began to grow more great, we began to see various manifestations of that set of choices across the country. And the one that I believe was most consequential was the rise of modern homelessness, which really dates to the late 1980s, and a series of public policy choices made at the federal level to make it much more difficult for poor people to stay in their homes. So we look at those choices, beginning actually in the 1960s with the Community Mental Health Act. If we look at the choices made in the 1980s with the devastating decisions to cut social program spending, especially in HUD. If we look at the decision in the 1990s to replace aid to families with dependent children with this new TANF system, which drastically cut the amount of cash resources going into the hands of individuals. If we look at the decisions to deregulate in a lot of ways the medical practices of the early part of this century, with this sort of artificial heroin crisis, opioid crisis that we created in those years. All of these were failed public policy choices on the part of government who believed that they were doing the right thing, sort of in this mindset of all these contradictions that are associated with our political economy, and especially a consumer-based capitalistic system. Those were the reasons that we created the crisis that we have around us today, from a public policy level at the national stage. All of those decisions, however, were rooted in a set of moral choices, a set of beliefs that understood social work, understood public subsidy, understood financial assistance to poor folks, understood those programs and practices as to be inherently, and this is the key point, as inherently harmful to our character. If you go back and look at the conversation in the 1990s, what you'll see is that there was a lot of conversation around how dangerous these social welfare systems were to the economic independence, to the livelihood, to the moral choices, to the future of low-income and poor people. And so the belief was we were doing them help, we were providing them help, we were doing them harm by allowing these older systems to remain, and we needed to incentivize, that was a key word of that decade, incentivize them to exit from poverty. Well, the problem with a lot of these philosophies is that they just didn't, when it came to the rubber meeting the road, they weren't very effective. And they just actually, in the end, opened up larger gaps for poor people as they tried to remain employed, as they tried to be able to provide childcare for their family, as they were trying to pay their electric bill and their water bill and their gas bill, as they were trying to pay for transportation to work. And then, especially, as we commodified housing at the end of the last century and well into this century, as to become the primary investment for most Americans, we made it exceptionally difficult for them to stay in their homes. And that has been really the genesis of modern homelessness, the commodification of housing across the country. If you look at what has happened to housing cost, if you look at what's happened to rents, especially in the last 5 years, it is next to impossible a lot of times for low-income individuals who are doing everything right, according to this older narrative, to even remain in their homes. And then, God forbid, that there is an addiction issue. God forbid that there is, a loss of a job or an injury at work, or someone goes to jail or to prison. Families are torn apart and those sorts of things, and it makes it extraordinarily difficult for people to stay inside. So when I look at the homeless crisis, what I see is something very different. I see it as a reflection of a lot of moral choices that the public has made across the country, a lot of a reflection of the public policy choices that government has made across the country that has created this condition. And the assumptions, most critically, the assumptions we bring to that is that somehow these people outside deserve the consequences that they are living in. And that, I think, is a very, very important, very key observation. Because let's back up just a little bit and go back and concentrate not so much on the homeless themselves, not so much on what caused, from a public policy perspective or an economic perspective, all of this to happen, but to think more about how we think about it, how we view it, and then understand a little bit about how those perceptions influence current policy and how those perceptions influence whether or not we are going to have even a fighting chance of solving homelessness as we go forward. One of the most critical things to understand in that conversation, perhaps the most critical thing to understand in that conversation, is simply, very, very simply, that modern homelessness exists because the rest of us believe that it benefits us in some way. Now that, to a lot of people in the room, to a lot of people around the state, to a lot of people around the country, might be a very shocking observation. But if you just step back just a little bit and look at our actions, not so much our words, but step back a little bit and look at our actions, we've increasingly created a climate and an environment where we are not serious at all about ending modern homelessness, even though, quite frankly, we're talking about just a few hundred, a few thousand people, and it is within our capacity to solve this problem. This is a great country with a deep history in terms of problem solving, the most exceptionally wealthy country that's ever existed on the face of the earth. We sent a man to the moon. We invented the iPhone. We've done all these just unbelievable things, and yet somehow we can't come up and find an answer to what is otherwise a very, very simple problem. And the reason for that is simply we don't want to. Look at the way in which we have invested funds in this particular issue over the course of the last decade. Compare, for example, the average budget of our larger high schools in the state of Oregon to the amount of money that we're investing statewide in the homeless crisis. It is a drop in the bucket. We're only doing just enough in terms of the investments that we are providing to keep the problem from getting worse. And I think that's probably the most important observation about what the collective impact and the consequences of our choices are leading us to. We're doing just enough to keep from being overwhelmed by the housing crisis and not enough to even begin to have the opportunity to solve it. So that is not an accident. It's not the function of us struggling to find the money somewhere. It's not just a consequence of living in a state with limited revenue options. It is a deliberate choice. We have decided that in a lot of ways, the homeless in some way benefit each and every one of us in the state, in the community, across the nation, because not having homelessness would require financial sacrifices of each and every one of us at a level in which we're not comfortable with. To be quite frank and quite direct, the wealthy population of this country sees benefit in continuing to allow this problem to exist, because the converse of that argument, that is, if they were truly committed to doing something to end it now, we would provide the resources that were necessary, as massive as they may be, to end this homeless crisis, especially unsheltered homelessness, and especially the mental health and addiction crisis that revolve around it immediately. We have the capacity to do so. But the wealthier interests across the country, this political economy of capitalism that we live in, disincentivizes actually solving this problem. It creates an ethos, it creates a culture and a climate where the folks who would have to sacrifice so that people in poverty, people who are homeless, would have enough to have a roof over their head at night, are unwilling, historically, unwilling to provide the resources, devote the resources, to support the resources necessary to tax themselves at a level that's necessary to solve this problem. So that's the first critical observation, that in some ways, modern homelessness is a byproduct of a financial decision that most of the wealthier people in this country have made to continue to tolerate it, because to some degree, maybe to a large degree, having this housing crisis benefits those individuals at the topper end of the economic scale. And how does it benefit them? Well, the commodification of housing in particular, people's largest personal investments is usually their home. Those homes have gained extraordinary value over the course of the last 20 years. If in some way, especially in Oregon with Measure 5 and Measure 50, if in some ways that we tax property based on the accordance of what is needed to support social services, to support the housing needs, the cost of the housing needs for the folks at the bottom of the political economy, if we were to do that, then the wealth that is in those homes, the wealth that is in those properties, the wealth that's generated at the top of the economic order would be diminished. A lot of folks have heard about how the wealthy in the United States, the top 1%, have paid less and less in taxes since the 1950s, that the concentration of wealth has gathered increasingly over the course of the last 20 and 30 years to the top 5%, the top 2%, the top 1%. Again, not an accident, a deliberate choice to make sure that wealth is concentrated at the top of the political economy and not the bottom, and to make sure that that wealth is prioritized at the top of the system, and that people at the bottom are going to have to struggle to survive. So that first observation, that homelessness exists because it benefits us, is absolutely critical. Now, the next corollary to that, on the other hand, is also something pretty simple. The fact is, most people, even the means, really struggle to come up with an explanation for why homelessness exists. This phenomenon of economic advantage is, for most people, I believe, something that they don't spend any time thinking about. They may not even be consciously aware of it, but it is quite real. But there's still sort of a psychological or emotional knee-jerk reaction when you roll down your window and you see somebody at a street corner with a sign asking for $5 for help. You see somebody crawling out of their tent in the morning after sleeping in a 25-degree weather overnight. There's a psychological response. It doesn't go back to understanding what the economic benefits of modern homelessness is for people in poverty, or for people of means. And so we have to come up with justifications. We have to come up with explanations that don't, in some ways, demonize ourselves for having a stake in the continuation of modern homelessness. We have to come up with reasons why that person is outside that's not really connected to any benefit that I may or may not have from living in a system, from living in a political economy that allows this kind of poverty to exist. So what's happened, and especially what's happening in Oregon today, is that we result or fall back on a lot of victim blaming. And by victim blaming, what I mean is essentially the fault of homelessness, the reason that people are in poverty, the reason that people are outside, all of that is the consequence of poor personal choices those folks made to end up where they are today. It is not my fault as somebody who owns a house, who owns a car, who holds down a good job, who pays my taxes, who goes to church, who goes to work, who does all the things the way that, we are supposed to do them. It's not my fault. I can't possibly have any benefit out of that situation. It has to be the fault of the person who's living outside. It has to be the fault of the person who's living in that tent. And so what we do is we assign a lot of blame. We assign a lot of character justifications. We assign to that person living in that condition certain sets of moral failures that explain and justify and even support why that person is living outside. So if you look across the state right now, what we see are conversations, especially about drug use and criminality, that the homeless are homeless because they're drug addicts. And if they could only stop using drugs, their lives would turn around. They would eventually, become housed. They would get jobs. They would be contributing members of society. And it's that criminal element, and inherently within those folks, moral weakness that has put them in a position where they have become drug addicts. Other elements of that conversation center around criminality in particular, that these are folks who, for whatever reason, want to live in a very anarchy-centered system, that they refuse to follow the rules and the order of civilized society, that they are dangerous, criminally dangerous to the rest of us, and need to be excluded from civil society, need to be excluded from participation. The other common determination is that folks who are living outside just do not have the backbone, the strength, the ambition, the desire to end their current living situation and to become housed, become employed, and to become socially constructive, productive members of society. And that piece in particular is a conceit. It is a ego-driven sort of analysis about why I am successful and you are not. I am in my position of wealth. I am in a home with a good job because I have worked harder. I have not allowed myself to give in to personal weaknesses. I have fought and fought and fought to climb and climb and crawl out of tough situations to become wealthy, to become successful. And that person outside naturally then, therefore, has had none of that conviction, none of those strengths, none of those desires to be hardworking, to be thrifty, to be, one of those individuals who are just getting up every morning and working very hard to improve their lives and the lives of their family and the lives of the world as a whole. In my experience, almost all of those things we tell ourselves about modern homelessness are more a reflection of the bias, more a reflection of the racism, more a reflection of economic judgments about ourselves than they are about the people who are living outside. The people who are living outside are no better or worse than the rest of us. They're not noble necessarily because of their condition, and they're certainly not criminal necessarily because of their condition. I've spoken many times about how this modern homeless issue is kind of a canary in a coal mine. It's a sign and a symptom that there is something inherently wrong, a rot in our society and civilization, but it is not a sign that it's something that's wrong with the homeless. It's a sign that something is wrong with the rest of us. And that gets back to this, sort of observation about that there is a kind of not only an economic benefit, which there obviously is in allowing folks to remain outside, but a kind of cultural benefit, a psychological benefit, an ego-based, inherent sort of superiority complex in the rest of us that tells ourselves that not only are we justified in leaving these people outside, and not only do they deserve to be outside because they've displayed a lack of moral rectitude and a lack of strength and a lack of conviction, but the rest of us are somehow okay because we have fought and clawed our way out of tough times and emerged on the other side of that in very strong financial positions. This whole thing is a great passion play, a great morality tale about why some people are successful in our society and some people are not. And I do believe that those sorts of psychological observations, those sorts of sort of larger social beliefs and practices around the existence of modern homelessness are doing great damage, certainly to the homeless, but also to the rest of us, because it is disconnecting us from our community ethic in such a way that it allows us to ignore these canaries and these coal mines all around us, not only in homelessness, but in other areas. It's allowing us to sort of wall ourselves off in modern gated cities. In a lot of cases, those gated cities are in our minds these days, to wall ourselves off from social obligation, to wall ourselves off from the Commonwealth, to wall ourselves off from the public good, and to say, I have no responsibility. I have no personal responsibility for the welfare of others. I have no responsibility for those who are living outside. I have no responsibility to improve the lives that people who are in poverty, people who are suffering, people who have been victims of violence, economic and otherwise, people who need addiction treatment. I have no responsibility for that. If they want to get out of that situation, we live in a political economy, these folks believe, we live in a political economy that will allow them to escape if only there's a desire to do so. One of the most damaging parts of the current public conversation in Oregon today is this war that's taking place over the way that we should be addressing homelessness. On the one hand, we have principles that are research-based, based in science, with about 15, 18 years worth of evidence now, called housing first. We are going to house people and then work on these other things that are getting in the way of them retaining housing and living healthy and productive lives. We're going to house them first. We're going to have low barrier shelters, low barrier housing programs where we're not going to impose preconditions on anybody for participation. And we are going to encourage folks to get better through harm reduction strategies, realizing that people are doing harm to themselves by drug and alcohol behavior. They're doing harm to themselves in a whole host of ways. And we want them not to go from a lot of harm to no harm. We just want them to do less harm over the course of time. So that's one mode of thinking on one side of that conversation. The other side of that conversation is inherently rooted in these very cultural assumptions I've been discussing this morning. This other side of this conversation is inherently rooted in those cultural assumptions because it wants to turn back to the clock, to a different time, to the 1980s and 1990s, when we took those moral judgments, those beliefs that help, those beliefs that social welfare programs were doing great and grievous harm to people who were in poverty, and we want to put the onus on them. We want to put the burden on them to get out of their own situation. So that side of the conversation favors, instead of housing first, it favors housing readiness. Instead of putting people inside, let's make sure that they are ready. And that's a loaded, weighted, judgmental, very powerful word, that they are ready to enter into housing. Housing first versus housing readiness. And instead of harm reduction, this older argument is that we need to focus and concentrate on treatment first. And there is also a very dangerous intonation in that, because if you think about what that means, it implies that there's no choice, that we are requiring, that we are forcing, that we're using the power of law even to make sure that people engage in treatment services. Now, we tried this older way of transitional housing, of housing readiness, and treatment first for 30 years. And it had a track record across the country of devastation and failure. Failure rates, 75, 80%. It is the primary reason, beyond these other cultural pieces and beyond the economic benefit that all of us have, to allow homelessness to continue to exist. But this conversation over the correct way to approach the problem has been, in my view, the single most destructive force in trying to solve the homeless problem, because it is trying to argue that we should return to a time of failed policies that absolutely, in a research sense, will not and cannot and will never work, because it is imposing moral conditions on essentially what is a medical and economic and social problem. And so that's where we sit at this moment today, at the precipice of making really smart or really dumb choices about what public policy should be going forward. So in closing, I would really like to make just a couple of points about what I think is going to solve this problem, or what I think is going to make this problem much worse. And then we have to begin with a few recognitions. The first recognition is that all of the economic forces that have created modern homelessness are growing worse by the day. The pandemic really escalated a lot of those forces, but they existed before the pandemic. They certainly exist after the pandemic, and they are growing worse every day. We are building the next generation of chronically homeless individuals in this state, hour by hour and day by day. It is going to be very difficult to change the political economy of the United States, or even the state that we live in. So we have to understand that we are always somewhat limited in terms of what the solutions are in front of us. But the gravity of the growing danger is continuing to get worse year in, year out. And unless we engage in smart public policy, we have virtually little chance, no chance in some ways, of being able to turn this crisis around. That's the first observation. The second observation really is that the solution to the problem isn't in the governor's office. It's not in who's president of the United States. It is not in which party controls the state house. It's in none of those things. It's not even in the hands of mayors and city council people and county commissioners. It is in the hands of each and every one of us as normal citizens, because the biggest part of the problem isn't the political leadership. It is not the homeless themselves. It's all the rest of us. And the way in which we view homelessness, the way in which we view the moral conclusions that we draw from observing people who are living outside. So what can we do going forward? Well, obviously, from all of this, we have to change who we are internally. We have to begin to, when we look at homelessness, we have to realize that we are not only looking into a mirror, but we're trying to come to some sort of reckoning, some sort of conclusion about our own lives and our own choices, and what we are going to demand, and I use that word very intentionally, what we are going to demand of our elected leadership in terms of how they address this problem. That is the most central and critical thing if we want to do anything about modern homelessness. We have to change ourselves first, and then we will begin to see some consequences of these policies taking place outside. And secondly, and perhaps critically important, we absolutely cannot allow this to become a partisan issue going forward. This has to be something that has general bipartisan support. It has to be a set of practices and a set of programs that are rooted in research-based, evidence-based practices that can be duplicated in every geography, that can be modeled as best practices, that are tested rigorously for their success, that are designed for public accountability, that are promoted as successful. Because without that, we're going to continue to sort of circle the drain as we're doing now in terms of the public policy that's in front of us. We just keep coming back to one central principle, and that one is we keep coming back to one central principle. And that central principle is, for each and every one of us, we have very little hope that what we see outside today is correctable. When you stop in downtown Portland, if you walk over to someone's tent, somebody standing on the street side, and you begin to have a conversation with them, if you're just driving by and make, whatever observation that you make, a lot of people leave those conversations and they leave those observations with a sense of frustration and despair. Confusion, quite frankly, frequently. One of the questions I get asked every day is, why do the homeless do this? Why do the homeless do that? Well, there's usually a very good reason. It's just not a reason that's relevant to your experience. But that confusion, that sense of frustration, and most importantly, that sense of hopelessness and despair teaches us that there is no solution to this problem. It teaches us that there is very little that we can do, no matter what the policy is, no matter what the program is, no matter what party is in power. None of those things really matter, because the problem is too big, the problem is too complex. But deep down inside, that soft voice that we hear at the end of those sorts of internal dialogues, what's not said out loud is that all of us may have to change a little bit. We may have to change who we are, how much we're willing to support financially in terms of programs. We might have to exit our comfort level just a little bit to do something to end the crisis that's growing and gathering around us. And so that's the only message. It's not the homeless, it's us. And the answer isn't for the homeless to change, it's for us to change.